In a previous series of videos, I described my journey of conversion from being an unaffiliated agnostic to a theist, to a Christian, and to eventually a Catholic Christian. I've also made some videos about why I think we should be giving more priority to our ancient heritage in the way that we incorporate aesthetic components like music and art and architecture in the way that we express our faith, which has given some people the impression that I might be more attracted to Eastern Orthodoxy if I gave it a chance. After all, I have long hair and a beard, so it just seems like a natural fit. And if I'm being totally honest, there's a lot in Eastern Christianity, especially its cultural expressions and its liturgy, that I do find really attractive. But like I said in one of my previous videos, where I was comparing Catholicism and Protestantism and telling the story about how I was evaluating those two things, there's a lot in Protestantism that I found really attractive as well. But that wasn't good enough for me to identify with that perspective. For me, the priority was about which one is true, and from there, I was going to do the best I could to try to pursue it based on that. Before I jump into the content of this video, I want to say how much deep admiration and respect I have for Eastern Christians, especially in light of the amount of oppression and persecution they've had to endure over the centuries. This video isn't an attempt to condemn Eastern Christianity or to establish my own supremacy as a Catholic, and nor is it an attempt to provide an apologetic for why everyone should be Catholic instead of Eastern Orthodox. I'm way too underqualified for something that ambitious. So instead, this is just an explanation for why I am Catholic instead of Eastern Orthodox. So after I became convinced by the claims of Christianity and the person of Jesus, I decided to try and find a church to call my own. But I quickly became confused by the disorienting variety of teachings and practices among the various denominations, and this forced me to confront the question of why these divisions exist in Christianity. So I started studying church history, and I quickly narrowed my focus between Catholicism and Protestantism. Eastern Orthodoxy didn't really register in my mind as a contender at the time for one very simple reason, which is that I'm an English-speaking white dude in a British Commonwealth country. So when people ask me why I'm not Eastern Orthodox, I get tempted to get into a theological throwdown about things like leavened and unleavened bread. But really the easiest way to answer that question is that I'm not Russian, Ukrainian, or Greek, or any other ethnicity that the Eastern churches in the city I live in serve. Because those churches were established by those ethnicities to serve those ethnic communities. When people of certain ethnicities were migrating or immigrating to places like Western Canada where I live, they brought their faith with them, and so often their national churches back home would send pastors to serve them in these communities. Meanwhile, and by contrast, Catholic missionaries were coming out here before anybody else. It wasn't like they were coming here to serve the needs of Roman citizens who were settling the West. They were coming out here to evangelize everyone. See, there's this universality that exists in Catholicism that doesn't really exist in Eastern churches. For me to become Eastern Orthodox, I would have to join a church with a very specific ethnic and national identity that isn't my own. And that's what's so immediately peculiar about the Eastern Orthodox churches. See, they derive their religious authority from the original churches that were established in metropolitan areas like Antioch or Alexandria or Jerusalem. But why would I, an Edmontonian in Alberta, Canada, submit to the authority of a patriarch from one of those metropolitan areas unless their authority was universal and transcended the borders of such a jurisdiction? But the problem is, that's exactly what they argued against in the original schism of East-West. When the division of East and West was escalating, the Eastern contingent was arguing that these original ancient churches, or pentarchies, because of their ancient origin as being established by the earliest missionaries and apostles, that they didn't have authority over one another, that they kind of had an autonomous authority. So in fact, I did have a little bit of an experience with an Orthodox church right around the time when I was becoming Catholic. At that time, I had just moved out and was living in the city for the first time away from home, and there was a Ukrainian Orthodox church, actually it was a cathedral, right in the neighborhood where I lived. It was literally like a block away. And so I thought, maybe I'll go check it out. And so this one afternoon, I just walked in there, and I was greeted by some of the people that worked there, and I asked them if it would be possible for someone like me to participate in the liturgy or to come and pray there from time to time. Their reaction was that they just looked at me like they didn't understand why an inquiry like this was coming from someone who wasn't already Ukrainian and already Orthodox. And I don't really remember how that brief and awkward exchange ended, but I remember getting the sense that they were relieved that I wasn't pressing on with my inquiry. You see, they were operating with an understanding that I should have had, which was that this was a Ukrainian church for Ukrainian people. But I don't believe for a second that Jesus intended for his church to be divided by the arbitrary lines drawn on maps by temporal powers to express their authority. In the Bible, St. Paul says that in Jesus there is neither Greek nor Jew. In other words, we aren't divided by things like our ethnicity, our nationality, or our gender. In Jesus, we are all one. The church is universal. When I first started looking for a denomination or a church to embrace, my primary concern was with trying to distinguish which is the original one that Jesus had established himself. And so with that came an assumption that I should look for the one that hasn't compromised or changed essential truths. So when I started researching church history, and especially these divisions that have taken place over the centuries, a point of contention that was common to all of these divisions was authority. So in the East-West Schism, the question was the authority of the Pope versus the authority of other bishops and patriarchs. In the Protestant Reformation, the question was the authority of the Pope again versus the exclusive authority of Scripture. And then in the English Reformation, it was again the authority of the Pope versus the authority of the King. So as you might guess, authority, how it's derived and where it resides, is a pretty essential component of the faith. So as I looked at all these various divisions, in my effort to distinguish which is the OG church that Jesus himself established, one of the assumptions that I maintained throughout it all was that whatever existed before each division should still continue to exist after. So if there's this break apart of two denominations, which of them still looks like it did before, and which of them no longer looks like it claims to have been from before that division? So in the case of the East-West Schism, there was a number of controversies that they were stuck on, but the most significant one seemed to be the disagreement about the authority of the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, versus the authority of the other bishops and patriarchs. Rome was insisting that the Bishop of Rome had a unique and universal authority over the entire universal church, whereas the eastern side of the controversy was trying to maintain this idea that the Bishop of Rome was a first among equals, which was like an honorary or honorific title, but that it didn't actually express any kind of supremacy of authority over the rest of the bishops. So that was their positions going into the controversy. So how true were they to those positions after it actually led to a deep division and a schism? Well, the West continued to maintain this idea that the Bishop of Rome had a unique and universal supreme authority over the entire universal church. But the East did not continue to treat the Bishop of Rome as a first among equals. In fact, they excommunicated him, which to me seems like a pretty clear contradiction of what they were arguing in the first place, which was that no autocephalous patriarch, that's like the original patriarchs, had authority over one another. So how can any of them excommunicate one of the other ones? And then as time went on, the Patriarch of Constantinople inherited the title first among equals. In closing, I want to give some consideration for what God's perspective or God's role in all of this might be. When I was considering the controversy or the claims between Catholicism and Protestantism, one verse in the Bible that really stood out to me and touched me quite personally was Jesus' prayer for Christian unity in the Gospel of John in chapter 17. See, this is his last prayer that he's making right before he's arrested and then sent off to be tried and crucified. So as you might guess, this is something that stands out in the Gospels and in the Bible and is one of those things that we should be giving a lot of priority to. In it, Jesus prays for unity among his disciples and his church, and that he believed that this would be a sign of his divinity to the entire world if his people were able to remain one. And so if we look at the history of East and West, whichever one seems to reflect that priority, I would think is going to be the one that's most correctly following in Jesus' footsteps. And from what little I know of the church's history, and especially the East and West schism, it seems to me that the West has always been the one extending that olive branch. We saw it early on in the councils of Lyon and Florence, where the West hosted all the major bishops from the East to discuss all these theological controversies and the divisions. And what ended up happening is that the Eastern bishops, all except for one, conceded and signed off on the controversies and Rome's position on things like papal supremacy, the filioque, and purgatory. And what ended up happening is that when the Eastern bishops went back home, they succumbed to political pressure to not honor that new unity that they had signed on to. It seems to me that Rome has always been the initiator of ecumenical dialogue. It was the First Vatican Council in which the mutual excommunications of East and West were lifted. And then it was the Second Vatican Council in which ecumenism was made a high priority for the Church, and this paved the way for the joint theological commissions of East and West. It was Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict who both respectively recited the Nicene Creed with Eastern patriarchs without the filioque. And it was the Bishop of Rome who first visited the East. It wasn't until 1995 that the Patriarch of Constantinople visited Rome. Lastly, I wonder if there's any providence in the fact that the East has suffered so much decline over the last millennium. Of the 5 original episcopal sees of the Roman Empire, only Rome is the one who has continued to enjoy safety and prosperity. Constantinople fell to the Turks, Alexandria was conquered by the Arabs, Antioch was completely devastated, and Jerusalem was also conquered by the Muslims. Rome had existed with the threat of Islamic invasion at several points, and one of the most severe was in the Battle of Lepanto, where we'll call it the Roman army, but it wasn't just Rome, but sort of the Christian fleet was outnumbered 3-1 by the Ottoman fleet, and by some miraculous intervention, they ended up being victorious over the Ottomans. Now, I'd hate to impose that providential interpretation on this dichotomy between East and West, but the Old Testament does repeatedly describe seasons of prosperity and strength for the people of Israel as being the result of their closeness and fidelity to God. And by contrast, it describes seasons of conquest as being a result of their infidelity to God. And so I won't be so bold to make that argument, but at the same time, I don't think we can easily dismiss it either. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that, then please consider subscribing and liking, and come find me on Facebook and Twitter. It's a huge help when you do that. It helps us get these videos in front of more and more people. And a big thank you goes out to You Catholic for presenting these videos. And if you want to support the making of these videos, then please consider supporting my work as a digital media and marketing expert. My company, Holdsworth Design, specializes in branding, web and graphic design, marketing, social media, videography, and all that kind of good stuff. So if you know of a parish, a diocese, a ministry, or a business that needs help in those areas, then please send them our way, and I'm sure we can help them out.